Your brain has cells for your kitchen, not cells that remember it, not cells that recognize it, cells that switch on when your body stands in one specific spot and go silent the moment you step away. This is not a metaphor. They are called place cells. They sit in your hippocampus, and their discovery won the Nobel Prize in 2014. Somewhere in your head right now there is a neuron whose entire job is one corner of a room you lived in as a child. It fired every time you stood there, thousands of times, and it has not fired since you left. That is not a poetic way of describing your nostalgia. It is a physical map, not a memory, not an image. A map built out of your own tissue, of every place you have ever spent time. And it is why the word home means something in every language on earth. The real neuroscience does not tell you that your brain stores photographs of the places you have loved. It tells you something considerably stranger, that your brain builds an internal spatial model of every environment you inhabit, that this model is constructed by dedicated machinery whose only function is location, and that the machinery for place sits in the same structure as the machinery for autobiographical memory, tangled together, sharing tissue, which means that where you have been and who you have been are not stored in separate systems, and that the reason a place can produce an emotion no photograph can produce is anatomical rather than sentimental. You do not remember your childhood home. You still contain it. Keep one idea beside you all night, because everything returns to it. You have always assumed that a place is outside you and your memory of it is inside you, and that the two are related the way a photograph is related to a landscape. That is not the arrangement. What is inside you is not a picture of the place. It is a map, built by dedicated machinery, in which particular cells stand for particular ground, and which you were standing in the whole time you were there. When you walk into a building you know well, you are not consulting a memory. You are entering a structure that exists in two places at once, in the world, made of brick, and in your head, made of neurons. And for the years you lived there, those two structures were continuously matched against each other. The map you are standing in. That is what a home is, physically, and it explains a great deal about what happens when the brick version goes away and the other one does not. A word about who this is for, because it has an audience it did not choose. If you have left a country, or sold a family house, or watched a building come down that you had memories in, some of tonight will be about a specific ache you have probably never heard explained. And if you are currently somewhere that does not feel like yours, there is a mechanism behind that too, and it is not a character flaw, and it is not ingratitude. So here is what tonight will do. First, the discovery, how researchers found cells that encode location, what they do, and the second discovery, a generation later that turned out to be even stranger, involving a grid of triangles that your brain apparently uses as coordinate paper. Second, why this system sits inside the memory structure rather than beside it, what that overlap explains about human experience, and why the first thing lost in the most common dementia is not names, but the ability to find your way home. And third, what all of this says about the feeling of home itself, what is actually happening when a place feels like yours, why leaving one is a specific kind of grief that people are embarrassed to admit, and why a person who has moved countries can spend decades feeling that the map underneath them does not match the ground. But first, the objection, because it is the right one and you may be forming it already. It goes like this. This is a category error. Place cells encode spatial location, which is a mechanical problem every mammal has to solve, in order to find food and avoid getting lost. Rats have them, bats have them. The feeling of home, by contrast, is a rich human emotion involving belonging, safety, family, and identity, and gluing a rodent navigation system to it is exactly the kind of move that makes popular neuroscience worthless. That objection is strong, and I accept the warning inside it. Here is why the connection is not decorative. The spatial system in question is not located in a navigation module off to one side. It is in the hippocampus, which is the same structure that binds together the elements of episodic memory, and damage to it produces both disorientation and a specific inability to form new memories of events. The overlap is not a metaphor imposed by a video. It is anatomical. It was discovered by people looking for navigation and finding memory, and the field has spent 40 years arguing about what to make of it. And there is a clinical fact that settles the question of whether the connection is real, though it settles it in the worst possible way. In Alzheimer's disease, one of the earliest symptoms, often preceding obvious memory complaints, is spatial disorientation, getting lost on familiar routes, becoming confused about which way the bedroom is, being unable to navigate a supermarket that has been visited weekly for 30 years. This is not incidental. The pathology begins in the entorhinal cortex, which is precisely where the grid cells live, and moves into the hippocampus, which is where the place cells live. The disease attacks the map first. Families interpret the getting lost as an early sign of memory failure, and in a sense it is. But the more accurate description is that the machinery which holds both the map and the autobiography is being dismantled from the map end. A person losing their way home and a person losing their history are not suffering two symptoms. They are suffering one, in a structure that never separated those functions. Start with the discovery, because the way it happened matters. In 1971, a young American researcher named John O'Keefe, working at University College London, was recording from single neurons in the hippocampus of freely moving rats. This was technically difficult, and the prevailing assumption was that the hippocampus was involved in something like memory or attention. So O'Keefe was looking for cells that responded to particular events or stimuli. It is worth appreciating what the work involved, implanting electrodes fine enough to listen to a single cell in an animal that had to be free to move, and then sitting and watching for hours while the cell clicked over a loudspeaker, trying to work out what it was responding to. The data arrived as sound, one neuron at a time, and the discovery came from someone noticing that the clicking started and stopped as the animal walked around. What he found instead made no sense under that assumption. Certain cells fired vigorously, and then stopped, and then fired again, and the pattern had nothing to do with what the animal was doing or what it could see. It correlated with one thing only: where the animal was standing. Move the rat to a different part of the enclosure, and the cell went quiet. Bring it back, and the cell resumed. Each cell had a location, and the location was its entire identity. The property that makes this genuinely strange, rather than merely tidy, emerged when researchers moved the animal to a different environment. The cells did not simply encode absolute space, as though the brain contained one enormous map of the world. Instead, in a new environment, the whole population reorganized. Cells that had encoded one corner of the first room now encoded some unrelated position in the second, and the relationships between cells were rebuilt from scratch. Researchers call this remapping, and it means the brain does not hold a single map, but a library of them, one per environment, each internally consistent and unrelated to the others. Which is why walking into a building you have not entered for 20 years produces such a specific and total sensation. You are not retrieving a memory of the place. A map is being loaded, and once it loads you know, without looking, that the bathroom is left at the top of the stairs, and your hand finds a light switch in the dark, in a house you left decades ago. O'Keefe called them place cells, and the implication he drew was radical enough that it took the field years to absorb. If individual neurons encode individual locations, then the brain is not merely responding to space, it is constructing a representation of it, an internal model that exists independently of what the eyes are currently seeing. He had, in effect, found a map, and it took years of resistance before the field accepted it, partly because the claim sounded philosophically extravagant, that a brain contains a representation of the world rather than merely reacting to it. Not a picture of a map, and not a memory of one, a functioning representation, built from cells, in which particular tissue stands for particular ground. And when the animal moved through the environment, the cells fired in sequence, the way a route unfolds. The brain was not navigating by looking, it was navigating by consulting something it had built. The second discovery came more than 3 decades later, and it is stranger. In 2005, 2 Norwegian researchers, May-Britt Moser and Edvard Moser, working in Trondheim, were recording from a region next door to the hippocampus called the entorhinal cortex, which feeds into it. They found cells that also responded to location, but not to a single location. Each of these cells fired at many places, and when the researchers plotted the firing across an environment, the pattern was not random. The locations formed a perfectly regular triangular grid, extending across the entire space the animal explored, like graph paper laid over the floor. Different cells had grids of different sizes and offsets, and together they formed a coordinate system, generated internally, not derived from any feature of the room. Sit with that, because it is one of the most surprising findings in modern neuroscience. Nothing in a rat's environment is arranged in triangles. Not the walls, not the floor, not anything the animal can see or smell. The grid is not out there in the world being detected, it is imposed by the brain, from the inside, as a way of measuring distance and direction. A self-generated coordinate system that lets an animal know how far it has gone, and in what direction even in the dark. The technical name for what the grid makes possible is path integration, and you use it constantly without noticing. Walk down an unfamiliar corridor, take 3 turns, and then point back toward where you started. Most people can do this reasonably well, without having consciously tracked anything, and without any landmark being visible. Something has been counting. It has been integrating your speed and direction continuously, updating a running estimate of your position relative to your origin, and it produces an answer your arm can point with, even though no part of you can state the calculation. Desert ants do this so well that after a long foraging journey along a wandering path, they turn and run in a straight line directly home. Human beings are worse at it than ants, and considerably better at it than they realize. And the grid appears to be the substrate, a hexagonal ruler generated internally, against which distance traveled is measured. Your brain does not know where you are because it can see. It knows because it has been counting your steps since you left. O'Keefe and the Mosers shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2014 for what the committee described as the discovery of cells that constitute a positioning system in the brain, and the same architecture has since been found in humans. In recordings made from patients undergoing surgery for epilepsy, who had electrodes placed in these regions for clinical reasons and agreed to participate in navigation tasks while the recordings were made. The map is not a rodent curiosity. It is in your head, in the same tissue, doing the same job. And the inventory has grown considerably since. There are head direction cells, which fire when an animal faces a particular direction and function as an internal compass, holding their orientation even in the dark. There are border cells, which fire when the animal is near a wall or edge, effectively drawing the outline of a room. There are speed cells, tracking how fast the body is moving, which the grid needs in order to keep count. And there are cells that respond to specific objects and to the distances between them. Together these constitute something that deserves the name it has been given, a cognitive map, in the strict sense, with a coordinate frame, an orientation reference, boundaries, a measure of motion, and landmarks. Your ability to walk to the bathroom at 3 a.m. without turning on a light. Without thinking, without any conscious sense of navigating at all, is that system running. It is one of the most sophisticated pieces of machinery in your head. It operates entirely below awareness, and until 1971, nobody knew it existed. There is one more property worth knowing before we hold the whole picture, and it is the one that connects the map most directly to sleep and memory. When an animal rests after exploring an environment, the place cells fire again, in sequence, replaying the routes it took, compressed into a fraction of the original time. This happens during sleep and during quiet waking, and it is one of the clearest demonstrations of memory consolidation ever observed. The brain rehearsing where it has been, over and over, apparently, in order to keep it. Which means that the map of the place you lived in as a child was not merely built while you were there. It was rehearsed every night for years, by machinery running while you slept, and that rehearsal is presumably part of why it is still in you at 50, when so much else is gone. So hold what we have. Cells whose entire function is one location. Discovered in 1971 by a man looking for something else. A coordinate grid generated from inside the brain and corresponding to nothing in the environment, discovered in 2005. A Nobel Prize in 2014 for what amounts to the finding that you carry a positioning system in your head, conformation in human tissue, and all of it sitting in the hippocampus and its neighbours, which is to say in the exact structure that builds your memory of your own life. That overlap is where this stops being a story about navigation, because the hippocampus was famous long before place cells for a completely different reason. It is the structure whose removal produces the most severe amnesia ever documented. In the patient known for decades in the literature by his initials, and now known by his name, Henry Molaison, who underwent surgery in 1953 and lived the rest of his life unable to form new lasting memories of events. That case established the hippocampus as central to episodic memory, the memory of things that happened to you. So the same tissue is doing two jobs that our vocabulary treats as unrelated, knowing where you are and knowing what happened to you. And the question the field has argued about for 40 years is whether those are two jobs at all, or one job that we have been describing with two words. The details of that case make the entanglement vivid. Molaison could hold a conversation, retained his childhood memories, and could learn new motor skills while denying he had ever practiced them. What he could not do was form new memories of events, and, tellingly, he also could not learn the layout of the house he moved into after the surgery, he lived there for years and never developed a reliable sense of where things were. Two deficits that sound entirely unrelated in one patient from one operation. Meanwhile, in the other direction, London taxi drivers who spend years memorizing the layout of an enormous city have been found to have measurably larger posterior hippocampi than controls, with the difference scaling with years of experience. The structure that grows when you learn a city is the structure whose loss prevents you from remembering your own life. Whatever these two capacities are, they are not neighbours. They are being done by the same organ, and the organ apparently does not distinguish between them as sharply as our vocabulary does. The most compelling suggestion is that they are one job. An episode, a thing that happened to you, is not a free-floating fact. It happened somewhere, and the somewhere is not incidental to it. Try to recall any event from your life and notice what arrives with it. A location arrives, always, unbidden, often more vividly than the content. You may not remember what was said in the conversation, but you know which room, which side of the table, which window the light was coming through. The place is not a detail attached to the memory. It appears to be part of the scaffolding on which the memory is built, which would explain why the machinery for place and the machinery for autobiography are made of the same tissue. You do not have memories located in places. Your memories may be located by places. Test that on yourself, because it takes 10 seconds and it is more convincing than any study. Pick any memory at all, an argument, a piece of good news, the moment you learned something that changed things. Now notice what arrived. Almost certainly a place arrived first, or at least simultaneously, and almost certainly in more detail than the content. People routinely cannot recall the words of a conversation that altered their life, and can describe the room with precision, where the light was, what they were sitting on, the position of a door. And notice what happens when you try the reverse. Try to recall an event with no location attached, floating free. Most people cannot construct one. The mind insists on putting it somewhere. And if it does not know where, it will supply a generic room rather than leave the question open. That insistence is the scaffolding showing through. A memory without a place is apparently not a format your brain supports, and the traditions discovered how to exploit that thousands of years before anyone recorded a neuron. There is a memory technique, described in Roman rhetorical manuals and attributed to a Greek poet named Simonides, which works by placing the things you wish to remember at specific locations in a building you know well. You walk through the building in your mind, depositing images in particular rooms, and later you walk the route again and collect them. It is called the method of Loki, or the memory palace, and it works extraordinarily well. Competitors in modern memory championships use essentially the same technique to memorize the order of shuffled decks of cards. Roman orators used it to deliver speeches lasting hours without notes. Nobody in antiquity had any idea why it worked. They simply found, empirically, that human memory has an enormous appetite for space and a poor appetite for lists, and they built their entire education in rhetoric on that observation. Now the break, firmly, Cicero did not know about the hippocampus, and the effectiveness of a memory technique is not evidence about neural architecture. A structural parallel is not a proof. But notice what the parallel legitimately shows, which is not small. 2,000 years before anyone could record from a single neuron, human beings had discovered by trial and error that the most reliable way to store anything in a mind is to attach it to a place, and had built a discipline around it that worked well enough to be taught for a millennium. The neuroscience did not create that insight. It arrived very late with an explanation for a technique that had been in continuous use since before the Roman Republic. And it is worth noticing that when researchers scan people using the method of loci, the regions that activate include exactly the spatial memory system we have been describing. The origin story attached to the technique is worth telling, whether or not it is true, because it captures the insight exactly. Simonides is said to have been reciting at a banquet when he was called outside, and while he was out the roof collapsed, killing everyone inside and crushing the bodies beyond recognition. Asked to help identify the dead, he found that he could name every one of them, because he could remember where each had been sitting. He had not memorized the guests, he had memorized the room, and the guests came with it. From that, the story goes, he derived the principle to remember a thing, put it somewhere. Cicero recorded the account 4 centuries later in a treatise on oratory, and the technique became standard equipment for anyone who had to speak at length without notes, which in the ancient world was everyone who mattered. It survived through the medieval period, was elaborated into enormous imaginary architectures by Renaissance memory theorists, and is still, today, the method by which people memorize thousands of digits for competition. 2,500 years of continuous use, from a banquet hall to a scanner, for a technique nobody could explain until 40 years ago. And this is only the first thread, because everything so far has been about the machinery, and the machinery is not what keeps anyone awake at 2 a.m. What keeps people awake is a room they cannot go back to, the house that was sold, the country they left, the apartment where something happened that they cannot revisit because it is somebody else's now. And there is a specific, well-documented, physically grounded reason why losing a place produces a grief that people are embarrassed to feel, why they apologize for it, why they say it is only a building. It is not only a building. Something in you was built to hold that ground, and it is still holding it. And there is a second question waiting behind that one, which is larger, and which the research has only recently begun to touch. Because the same machinery, it turns out, may not be restricted to physical space at all. There is a growing body of work suggesting that these systems are used for mapping things that have no geography whatsoever, relationships between concepts, social hierarchies, the space of possible decisions. Grid-like signals have been detected in humans navigating entirely abstract spaces, which raises the possibility that the brain solved the problem of physical navigation first, hundreds of millions of years ago, and then reused the solution for thought itself. If that holds, then the sense of being lost that people describe after a divorce, or a redundancy, or a bereavement, is not a poetic borrowing from the vocabulary of navigation. It may be the same system reporting the same failure about terrain that has nothing to do with rooms. That is where we go next. You can be lost with no rooms. You know the state, a divorce, a redundancy, a death, and you reach immediately for the vocabulary of navigation to describe what is happening to you. Lost, adrift, unmoored, not knowing which way to turn. This is not a metaphor, or the evidence is beginning to suggest it is not. Over the last decade, researchers have found that the same machinery your brain uses to map a room appears to run when you navigate things with no geography at all. Your relationships, your decisions, your standing among other people. The grid that measures distance across your kitchen floor also appears to measure distance across your ideas, which raises a possibility that reorganizes the whole subject. You may not have a spatial system and a thinking system. You may have a map, and everything else may be running on it. The finding that opened this came from imaging studies asking whether the hexagonal signature of grid cells shows up in humans doing tasks that are not spatial. It does. When people navigate abstract spaces, arranged along dimensions with no physical dimension, such as varying the neck length and leg length of a cartoon bird, the entorhinal cortex produces the same six-fold signal it produces when someone walks across a room. Studies of social cognition have found similar structure, with people appearing to represent the standing of others along dimensions of power and affiliation in something resembling a two-dimensional map. This is a young literature, and it should be held with appropriate caution, which I will come back to. But the direction it points is remarkable, that the brain solved navigation first, hundreds of millions of years ago, and then reused the solution for thought. Let me be careful about how strong that claim is, because this is exactly the kind of finding that gets inflated. The bird morphing study and its successors detect a statistical signature in imaging data, six-fold symmetry in the signal, which is taken as evidence of grid-like coding. That inference is reasonable, and it is indirect. Nobody has recorded a grid cell firing while a person thought about a friendship. The social space work is a small and young literature, and the whole area sits in a corner of neuroscience where the temptation to overinterpret is severe because the story is so appealing. So the honest statement is this: there is suggestive evidence that the spatial system participates in representing non-spatial relationships. It is taken seriously by serious people, and it is not established. Hold it as a promising hypothesis rather than a finding, and notice that everything else tonight stands whether or not it survives. So this stretch does three things. First, the evidence for that reuse, what it does and does not show, and why an ancient navigation system would be an obvious thing for evolution to repurpose. Second, the consequence that matters most to anyone listening at this hour, which concerns what happens when a map is invalidated, not lost, but wrong, still loaded, and no longer matching the ground. And third, the specific grief of losing a place, why people apologize for feeling it, and why the apology is unwarranted. Take the reuse first, because the logic is compelling before any evidence arrives. Navigation is one of the oldest problems a mobile creature faces, and it is enormously demanding. You must know where you are, where things are relative to you, how to get back, and how to plan a route through territory you cannot currently see. Evolution solved that problem a very long time ago, and the solution has a general shape. It represents entities as positions in a space, it encodes relationships as distances and directions, and it permits planning by simulating movement through the representation before committing the body. Now notice that this is also, precisely, the shape of thinking. To consider two options is to place them somewhere and compare. To weigh an argument is to imagine a balance. To hold a position is to occupy ground. To recognize that one idea is close to another is a statement about distance. To plan is to simulate a route. And when a brain that already has a machine for doing exactly that with rooms begins doing it with concepts, evolution has not built a second machine. It has pointed the existing one somewhere else. And you can hear the borrowing in every language, which is the oldest evidence available, and the one people dismiss, because it is too familiar. Not a few phrases, the entire apparatus. Time itself is described spatially in every language anyone has examined as something you move through or that moves past you, with the future ahead and the past behind, and there is no known language that describes time without borrowing from space. We speak of close friends and distant relations, of being in a good place, of a position on an issue, of moving on, of going in circles, of being at a crossroads, of falling behind, of a field of study with boundaries and frontiers. Those are not decorative flourishes. They are so pervasive and so consistent across unrelated languages that linguists have argued for decades that abstract thought is systematically structured by spatial metaphor. The usual reading is that we borrow spatial language because it is concrete and available. The neuroscience raises a different possibility that we speak of thought in spatial terms because thought is being processed by spatial machinery, and the language is not a borrowing but a report. So hold that. A navigation system, ancient, precise, built to represent locations as positions and relationships as distances. A hexagonal coordinate signal that turns up in humans doing tasks with no physical space in them at all. Social and conceptual information that appears to be represented in map-like structures. And a vocabulary in every language ever examined that describes thinking as movement through terrain. 4 separate lines, pointing the same way, none of which was gathered with the others in mind. Now the consequence, and this is where the night turns toward what actually keeps people awake. Consider what it is like when a map stops matching the ground, not being lost, which is merely the absence of a map. Something worse and more specific, having a map that still loads, in full detail, on demand, and that no longer corresponds to anything on the earth. Anyone who has moved house knows the trivial version. For weeks afterward you reach for a light switch that is not there, walk toward a door on the wrong wall, and wake in the night briefly unable to work out which side of the bed to get out of. Your old map is still loading. Your body is still running on it, and the world keeps failing to comply, and for a period you live in a mild continuous friction that resolves, eventually, as a new map is built. Notice what that period is actually like, because everyone has been through it, and nobody describes it accurately. It is exhausting in a way that seems disproportionate to the objective difficulty of learning where the cutlery is. A person who has just moved is frequently tired for weeks, irritable, unable to concentrate on work, and blames the boxes. Some of it is the boxes. Some of it is that a system which normally runs entirely below awareness, costing nothing, has been thrown into conscious operation, so that every trip to the bathroom now requires a small deliberate act of navigation instead of none at all. Multiply that across a day, and the fatigue is not mysterious. And notice the moment it ends, which everyone can recognize in retrospect, the first time you get up in the night and reach the bathroom without thinking. That is not familiarity in any vague sense. That is a map completing, and the relief people feel at that point is the relief of a machine going back to automatic. Now scale that up. A person who has left a country lives that friction permanently in a form nobody around them can see. The map that loads automatically without being called is of somewhere else, which shop is on which corner, what the light does in the afternoon, how far it is from the station to the house, what the road sounds like. That map is still being maintained by machinery that has no idea the person emigrated, and the new country, however good, is being processed by a second map that took years to build and remains thinner, requiring conscious attention where the first one required none. This is the specific, unglamorous exhaustion of living somewhere foreign, and people almost never name it correctly. They call it homesickness, which sounds like sentimentality, and which used to be classified as a medical condition. Military physicians in earlier centuries treated it as a genuine and sometimes fatal illness in soldiers far from home, and were mocked for it later. And what it actually is, at least in part, is the metabolic cost of navigating consciously in a place where your automatic system has nothing loaded. And it explains a pattern that migrant families recognize immediately and rarely have language for. The parent who left at 30 and the child who arrived at 4 are not living in the same country, in a sense that is more literal than it sounds. The child's automatic map is of the new place. It was built during the years when maps are built most readily, and it requires no effort. The parent's automatic map is of somewhere thousands of kilometers away, and everything in the new country is being processed by a slower, later, more effortful system. They walk down the same street and are doing measurably different amounts of work, which is why the parent often seems, to the child, to be dwelling on the past, and why the child seems to the parent to have lost something. Neither is quite right. They are running different maps, and the difference is not a matter of loyalty or attitude. It is a matter of when the machinery was available. And there is a version that is worse, because the ground did not move. The person did not go anywhere. The house was sold. The building came down. The street was redeveloped, or the family broke up, and the place that was home became somebody else's address. In those cases, the map remains perfect, and the referent is gone, and there is no possibility of updating it, because there is nothing to update it against. The map of your grandmother's kitchen is intact in you, in tissue, and it will remain intact, and the kitchen does not exist. People find this state very difficult to describe, and are often ashamed of how strongly they feel it, particularly when the place was ordinary, and particularly when other people say things like, "It was only a house." It was not only a house, not only bricks, not only a place you happened to be for a while. It was one of the maps you are made of, and the fact that it now points at nothing is a real condition rather than a sentimental one. There is a word for a version of this that has been coined recently and is worth knowing, because a great many people are living in it without a name for what they have. Solastalgia describes the distress produced when the place you live in changes around you while you remain in it. Development, deforestation, flooding, the slow alteration of a landscape by climate or economics, so that a person can be homesick without having gone anywhere. The map is invalidated by the ground moving rather than by the person moving, and the effect appears to be similar and is harder to legitimize, since nobody has left and nothing dramatic has occurred and there is no event to point to. Older people in rapidly redeveloped cities describe this constantly and are usually told they are resisting progress. Some of them are, and some of them are reporting, without the vocabulary, that the structure they carry no longer matches the structure they are standing in, and that this produces a specific and continuous friction that the young people around them, whose maps were built on the current version, do not experience at all. Which explains something people do compulsively and cannot justify. They go back. Long after there is any reason, they drive past the old house, walk the street they grew up on, stand outside a building they cannot enter, and they usually do it alone, and often do not mention it afterward. Ask them why and they will say they do not know, or that they were in the area, which is frequently untrue. What appears to be happening is that the map is being run against the ground. The automatic system loads. The body walks the route it has walked thousands of times, and for the duration of the walk, the internal structure and the external structure are matched again, which is a sensation available in no other way. People describe it afterward as feeling that they had briefly been the person who lived there, which is a strange thing to say about walking down a street, and is precisely what you would predict if a map from that period had loaded and everything indexed to it had come with it. And people report, consistently, that the experience is not pleasant exactly, and that they would not have missed it. That is why the visit is so often silent and so often solitary. Something is being done that does not have a name, and it is being done with the body rather than with the memory, and it cannot be accomplished by looking at photographs. The most common report from these visits is worth noting because it is so consistent and so widely misinterpreted. Everything is smaller. The road is narrower than it should be. The house is a fraction of its remembered size. The distance between two places that took forever to walk turns out to be 2 minutes. People usually attribute this to childhood perception, to having been small, and that is part of it. But there is another factor which follows directly from tonight's account. The map was built by a body of a particular size, moving at a particular speed, and distance in that system is measured in the units the body was using at the time. A route that took 200 small steps is stored as a 200-step route. Return with adult legs, and the ground has apparently shrunk, because the map is reporting honestly in a currency that no longer applies. That specific disorientation, standing in a corridor that is too short, is one of the strangest and most reliable experiences available to a returning adult, and almost nobody has ever been told why it happens, and this is where the strangest documented consequence appears, because that compulsion does not stop when the ability to plan a journey does. Wandering is one of the most common and most distressing behaviours in dementia, and carers describe it as aimless, but the accounts of what people say while doing it are remarkably consistent across countries and decades. They are going home. That is what they say, almost without exception, in every country where anyone has bothered to write it down. Frequently to a home that has not existed for 50 years, sometimes to a parent long dead, and the urgency is enormous and unreachable by argument. It is usually treated as confusion, and in one obvious sense it is. But given what we now know about which structure the disease damages first, another reading is available, and it is more uncomfortable. The map of the present has degraded. The old map, laid down decades earlier and rehearsed for years, has not degraded as far. So the system does what it was built to do. It consults the best map it has, and heads for the place that map says is home. The person is not confused about wanting to go home. They are navigating correctly, using an atlas that is 60 years out of date. That reading has a practical consequence which carers and clinicians have arrived at independently, and it is worth stating because it changes how people behave in a distressing situation. The instinct. When someone insists on going home while standing in their own living room, is to correct them. You are home. This is your house. Look, that approach reliably produces distress. Because it is contradicting something the person is not mistaken about at the level where it matters, their system has produced a correct answer from the map it has. What works better, according to a great deal of practical experience and a growing body of guidance, is to engage with the feeling rather than the fact, to ask about the home they mean, who is there, what it looked like, and to let them describe it. This is sometimes framed as therapeutic lying, And it is not really a lie. It is declining to fight a navigation system with an argument. The person wants to go home, which is one of the most legitimate wants a human being has, and the version of home their machinery is holding is the one they lived in longest and rehearsed most. Meeting them in that map is not deception, it is going to where they are. The traditions treated place as sacred in ways that a purely practical account of navigation cannot explain, and it is worth noticing how physical their practices are. Pilgrimage is the clearest case. Nearly every major tradition has one, and in every case, the point is emphatically not information. Nobody undertakes a pilgrimage to learn where a place is. They know where it is, and photographs are available, and the entire value lies in the body making the journey and standing on the ground. The Hindu traditions have a vast geography of tirthas, crossing places, where the journey itself is the practice. Islamic pilgrimage requires a specific set of physical movements at a specific location. Christian and Jewish traditions have their own, some involving walking for weeks to arrive somewhere the pilgrim could have flown to in hours. And in every case the insistence is the same, that being present in a place does something that knowing about the place does not, and that the doing must be performed by a body. Now the break, firmly, pilgrimage traditions were not built on any theory of spatial cognition. They make theological claims I am not evaluating. And the fact that a practice involves place does not confirm anything about the entorhinal cortex. A structural parallel is not a proof. But there is something legitimately here. Every tradition that has thought carefully about the relationship between a person and a place has concluded that presence is not substitutable, that you cannot send a proxy, that the map is not the territory and the photograph is not the place. And they were right for reasons they could not have stated, since it now appears that a person standing somewhere is running machinery, that a person looking at a picture of somewhere is not. The pilgrim is not gathering information. They are loading a map with their body on the actual ground. And the traditions extend this beyond pilgrimage into practices that make even less sense on an informational account. Sacred ground is frequently defined by an event that happened there, sometimes thousands of years earlier, with nothing physically distinctive remaining. This is where he stood. This is where it happened. And the ground is treated differently from the ground 10 meters away for that reason alone. Shoes are removed at thresholds in several traditions, which is a bodily acknowledgement that this particular floor is not like other floors. Burial practices anchor the dead to specific coordinates, and the visiting of graves is one of the most widespread human behaviors. Performed by people who do not believe the dead are located there in any literal sense, and who go anyway, and who report that going matters, and that not going is different. Jewish tradition faces prayer toward a particular city. Islamic practice orients every prayer toward a specific building, so that 5 times a day a person's body is aligned with a point on the earth. In none of these cases is the place delivering information. The place is being stood in, faced, walked to, or touched, and the standing is the practice. So the picture is assembling. A dedicated system that builds maps of every environment you inhabit, sitting inside the structure that builds your memory of your own life. A coordinate grid, generated internally, that also appears to run when you navigate ideas and relationships. Maps that remain loaded after their referents are gone, producing a specific and widely misdescribed grief. And a compulsion to return, in the healthy and in the ill, that appears to be the system attempting to match its map against ground. But there is a question this leaves standing, and it is the one that decides whether any of this is useful to anybody. If home is a map rather than a place, then a map can presumably be built again, which would mean that the feeling of home is not something you either have or have lost, but something constructed by a process with known inputs over a known timescale by anyone anywhere. That is either the most hopeful sentence in this entire subject or a considerable overstatement of what the evidence supports, because there is a complication, and anyone who has emigrated will already have spotted it. If maps can simply be rebuilt, why does the second one so often feel thinner than the first, decades later, in people who love where they live and have no wish to return? Something is different about the maps of childhood, and about the maps built during the years when a person is forming, and about maps that were rehearsed nightly for a decade, rather than assembled over a busy year in adulthood. So the answer is not going to be a simple yes. It is going to be a distinction between two things we call home and have never separated: the place where your automatic system runs without effort, which can be rebuilt anywhere by anyone given enough time, and the place your machinery was originally calibrated against, which cannot. Sorting out which of those a person actually needs and what to do when they have only one of them is where we go next. You can build a home anywhere. That is your hopeful sentence, and it is half true, and the false half is the half that hurts you. Your brain constructs a spatial map of any environment you spend time in, automatically, without asking you, and given enough months in a new place, your map will complete, and you will stop having to think about where anything is. This is not a metaphor. It is the same machinery, running the same process, and it does not care which country you are in, or whether you chose to be there. So that automatic sense of a place being yours is genuinely available to you, anywhere, on a fairly predictable schedule. But there is a second thing you mean by home, and it is not the same thing at all, and it cannot be rebuilt. The distinction is this: there is the place where your automatic system runs without effort, which is a matter of accumulated exposure, and which you can obtain in a new city within a year or two. And there is the place your machinery was originally calibrated against, laid down during the years when maps form most readily, rehearsed nightly through a childhood, and bound to the tissue that also holds your first memories of being a person. The first is a functioning map. The second is a foundation. A person can have both, which is the ordinary case for anyone who never moved. A person can have the first without the second, which is the condition of most migrants and a great many people who moved for work at 25. And a person can have the second without the first, which is what it is like to visit the town you grew up in after 30 years away and find that you can navigate it perfectly and do not live there. That third case is worth dwelling on because almost nobody expects it, and everybody who experiences it finds it disorienting. You return to the town, and your body knows things your mind does not. Your feet take a turning before you have decided to. You know that the road bends before you can see it bend. You reach for a door handle at the height it used to be. The map is intact and running. And at the same time you are a visitor. You do not know the shops. The people are strangers. And the place has continued for 30 years without consulting you. Two things are true simultaneously, and they do not integrate. You are from here in a sense that goes down to the tissue, and you are not of here in any sense that matters practically. People come away from those visits unsettled, and usually cannot say why, and this is the reason. They were expecting either recognition or estrangement, and they got both at once, from two different systems, neither of which is wrong. So this stretch does three things. First, how a map is actually built, what the inputs are, and why the timescale is what it is, which matters enormously if you are currently living somewhere that does not feel like yours. Second, why childhood maps are different, whether that difference is permanent, and what the evidence says about people who move as adults. And third, the question underneath all of it, which is what a person is supposed to do when the foundation is somewhere they cannot return to, and whether anything can be done at all. Start with construction, because it is more specific than people assume. A spatial map is not built by looking, not by studying, not by being told. It is built by moving, and this is one of the clearest results in the field. Studies comparing people who explore an environment on foot with people who study a floor plan or a map of it find that the two produce different kinds of knowledge, route knowledge and survey knowledge, learned differently and used differently. And the machinery we have been describing, the grid, the place cells, the head direction system, is driven by self-motion. It integrates your own speed and turning. A passenger and a driver do not build the same map of the same journey, and anyone who has been driven somewhere 100 times and then had to drive it themselves has discovered this the hard way. The distinction between those two kinds of knowledge is worth having properly, because it explains a great deal about why some people seem to have a sense of direction and others do not. Route knowledge is a chain, from the door, left at the postbox, past the school, right at the lights. It is sequential, it works beautifully as long as you are on the route, and it collapses entirely the moment you are diverted, because a chain has no information about what lies beside it. Survey knowledge is different in kind. It is a bird's eye representation in which locations have positions relative to each other, and it permits shortcuts. You can leave a known route, cut through unfamiliar streets, and arrive, because you know roughly where the destination is, rather than merely how to get there. Most people begin with route knowledge in a new place, and, given enough traversal, develop survey knowledge, and the transition is noticeable when it happens. There is a specific day, usually months in, when you take a shortcut for the first time in a new city, and it works. That is not a small event. That is your map going from a list to a structure, and once it happens, the place changes character, because you are no longer following instructions in it. You are moving through something you possess, which yields a practical consequence that sounds trivial and is not. If you have moved somewhere and it does not feel like yours, the thing that builds the map is walking, not researching the area, not looking at it online, not being driven through it. Walking, repeatedly, without a destination, allowing the routes to connect to each other, because what turns a set of known points into a map is the accumulation of paths between them. People who move to a new city and commute by car or underground can live there for years with a strange archipelago in their heads, a set of disconnected islands, home and office and a few shops, with no sense of how any of them relate. They will tell you the city never felt like theirs. The map never completed, because the connective work is done by the body moving through the space between things, and they were never in the space between things. There is a contemporary version of this problem that deserves attention, because it is affecting nearly everyone and has arrived too recently for anyone to have measured its consequences properly. Turn-by-turn navigation removes the requirement to build a map. If a voice tells you to turn left in 200 meters, you can arrive at any destination in any city without ever forming a representation of how that city fits together, and there is now a body of work suggesting that habitual reliance on satellite navigation is associated with poorer spatial memory and reduced engagement of the hippocampal system, with some studies finding that people who follow instructions show less activity in these regions than people navigating from their own knowledge. The findings are still developing and should not be overstated, but the mechanism is not controversial. The map is built by the effort of building it, and a system that removes the effort removes the construction. Which means that a person can now live in a city for a decade, having been driven through every part of it by a voice, and possess almost none of it. That is a new way to be a stranger somewhere, and it is being adopted universally without discussion. The second input is repetition, and the third is sleep. We know from the replay research that routes are rehearsed during rest and sleep, which means that a map is not only built while you are in the place, it is consolidated afterward, in the dark, by machinery running while you are unconscious. A person who walks a new neighborhood for a week and then sleeps badly for a month is not building the same map as a person doing the same walking with intact sleep. And repetition matters in a specific way. It is not total exposure that counts, but repeated traversal of the same routes with variation. The map is built out of paths taken more than once, from slightly different directions, until the relationships between locations stabilize, which is why a place you have visited 50 times as a tourist can remain a set of images, and a place you have lived in for 4 months and walked at different times of day begins to be a structure. The variation requirement is the part people get wrong most often, and it has a specific explanation. If you always approach a location from the same direction, at the same speed, at the same time of day, what you build is a single view rather than a position. The place becomes a picture taken from one angle, and if you arrive from the other side, you will not recognize it, which everyone has experienced and found disconcerting, standing in front of a building you know well, from an unfamiliar approach, and simply not knowing what you are looking at. What converts a view into a location is arriving at it from multiple directions, so that the system can triangulate and place it in a coordinate frame, rather than storing it as an image. Which is why deliberately taking a different route home, which sounds like the kind of advice printed on a calendar, is actually a precise instruction to the machinery. It is not about novelty for its own sake. It is about giving the system the second and third angles it needs in order to convert a set of pictures into a map. So hold the recipe, because it is unglamorous and it is the whole thing. Self-motion, not observation. Repeated routes rather than single visits. Connections between places rather than isolated destinations. Sleep, to consolidate what was walked, and time, in the order of months rather than weeks, and closer to a year than to a season. That is how a human being comes to feel that a place is theirs, and every part of it is available to anyone in any city, and almost nobody does it deliberately, because nobody has ever been told that home is a construction project with known materials. Now the harder question. Why is the map of a childhood different if the process is the same? Several factors compound, and none of them is mystical. The first is duration and density. A child in one house for 15 years accumulates a quantity of traversal that no adult relocation matches in a period when very little else is competing for encoding. The second is scale. A child explores at the scale of a body that is small and slow, on foot, in enormous detail, at ground level, and covers the same 50 meters thousands of times in a way that no adult ever covers anything. The third is that a child is not merely learning a map, they are simultaneously forming everything else, and the place is the container in which all of it happens. So that the map ends up indexed to a very large proportion of the person's earliest autobiographical material. And the fourth is simply that it is first, and firsts encode differently, as everything in this account keeps demonstrating. The scale point deserves elaboration, because it explains the texture of childhood place memory in a way nothing else does. Ask an adult to describe the house they grew up in, and you will often get the floor, in unreasonable detail, the pattern of a carpet, the grain of a step, the specific gap under a piece of furniture, the temperature of a particular tile. That is not sentimentality selecting the small. It is a map built by a body that was closer to the ground, slower, more often under tables and behind sofas, and for whom the distance from one room to the next was a journey rather than a step. Children map at high resolution because they move at low speed through small territory thousands of times, and because the territory is genuinely large relative to them. An adult crossing the same house registers a hallway. A child registered the hallway as a landscape with regions, which is why the returning adult finds everything smaller, and why the details that survive are so often at knee height. There is a further condition of childhood that has quietly disappeared and that deserves naming, because it is the input most obviously missing from the childhoods being constructed now. Building a map of a neighborhood requires being in the neighborhood, unsupervised. On foot, repeatedly, with the freedom to take the wrong turning. Within living memory, that was simply what children did. The range over which a child was permitted to roam alone has contracted dramatically across a few generations in many countries, from something like a mile or more at 8 years old to, in a great many households, the end of the street or nothing at all. Whatever the merits of that change in terms of safety, and the argument is genuinely complicated, one consequence follows directly from everything tonight. A child driven between supervised locations is not building a map of anywhere. They are accumulating a set of destinations with nothing in between, which is precisely the archipelago we described in adults who commute by car. Arriving at the age of 18 without the foundation that older generations acquired without noticing, whether that matters and how much, is not something anyone can yet say. It is not nothing, and it is happening at scale, and nobody chose it deliberately. So the difference is real, and it is not mysterious. It is quantity, scale, timing, and entanglement with everything else that was being laid down. Which raises the obvious question, and here I want to be careful, because it is the question everyone in this situation actually wants answered. Can a later place ever become that? The honest answer is, not that. No, not the same thing. Not by trying harder, and not by staying longer. Not the foundation, which was built once by a process that cannot be repeated at 40, because you are not forming a person anymore, and you cannot walk the same 50 meters 10,000 times with a child's body. But that is a narrower loss than it first appears, and the reason is worth stating carefully. What people usually want, when they say they want a place to feel like home, is not the foundation. They want the automatic map, the sense of ease, the ability to move through a place without deliberation, the feeling of being from somewhere rather than in it. That is obtainable. It takes longer than people expect, and it is built by walking, and it is genuinely available in a new city at 60. The people who never obtain it are, in my reading of the accounts, rarely the ones who moved too late. They are the ones who never walked, who lived provisionally for a decade in a place they had already decided was temporary, and whose maps therefore never had a reason to complete. Provisionality is the thing that prevents it. A map is built by a body that behaves as though it lives somewhere. Let me put a scene in front of you, because it is late, and one case does more than another study. A man emigrates at 34, not fleeing anything. He applied for a job and got it. He builds a life, a good one, in a city he came to by choice and does not regret. 20 years pass. He is competent there, he has friends, he knows where everything is, and he would not go back. And every so often, without warning, walking down a street he has walked 1,000 times, something surfaces that he cannot explain to anyone around him, a sense that this is not the arrangement. Not that it is bad, that it is not the arrangement, as though the ground were a translation of something. He has never said this out loud, because it sounds ungrateful and slightly mad, and because the people who would understand it are all in another country, and if he did say it, the response would almost certainly be a suggestion: visit more often, join something, learn the language better, stop living in the past. All reasonable, all beside the point, and all of them implying that the condition is a failure of effort. He has made every effort. That is not the variable. What is happening to him is not mysterious under the account we have built. His automatic map of the new city is complete and works. But the map underneath it, the one laid down when the machinery was calibrating, describes a different arrangement of the world, different distances, a different relationship between light and time of day, streets that met at different angles. That map is not competing for use, since it would be useless where he lives, but it has not gone anywhere, and occasionally something in the environment resonates with it, and the mismatch registers. He is not homesick in the ordinary sense. He does not want to return, and returning would not help, because the place he is matched to is a version of somewhere that stopped existing when he was 34. What he is experiencing is the permanent condition of anyone who moved after their foundations were laid. 2 maps, one useful and one true, and no way to bring them into alignment. And there is a phenomenon among long-term migrants that follows from this, and that people find deeply confusing when it happens to them. After enough years, going back stops working. The visit that used to produce relief begins producing a different feeling. The place has changed. The map does not match it either anymore. The people have moved on, and the visitor discovers that they are now a foreigner in both countries. This is often described as the worst part of migration, and it arrives late, sometimes decades in, when it is least expected. Under the account we have been building, it is not surprising. The foundation map is of a place at a time, and the place kept moving after the person left. So the match degrades from both ends. The person's map is frozen, and the ground is not, which means the condition is not a failure to keep in touch or to visit often enough. It is arithmetic. Anyone who leaves anywhere for long enough ends up matched to a version of somewhere that no longer exists, and there is no country in the world where that version can be found, including the one on the passport. And there is a factor in his situation that the spatial account alone cannot cover, and which honesty requires putting on the table, because a video about place cells could easily imply that home is entirely a matter of geometry. It is not. A very large part of what people mean by home is other people, the ones who knew you before, who share your references, who do not require translation. A migrant is frequently mapping a new city perfectly well and grieving something else entirely, which is the absence of anyone who was present for the first 30 years. And it is worth noticing that the two are connected in the anatomy we have been describing, since the hippocampal system binds place to episode, and episodes contain people. The map of a childhood street is not a map of a street. It is a map of a street with particular people on it, most of whom are elsewhere or dead. So when someone says they miss a place, the correct reading is usually that they miss a place and people and period, which is a compound object that no aeroplane can return them to. And this is why going back so often disappoints in a way people find difficult to admit. So what can be done, given that? 3 things, and none of them is a solution, because there is no solution, and anyone offering one is not being straight with you. The first is naming, and it is not nothing, knowing that this is a structural feature of having moved, rather than evidence of a failure to settle, or of ingratitude, or of some flaw in the new place, changes how heavily it lands. A very large number of people carry this and interpret it as a personal deficiency. The second is building the second map properly, rather than half building it, which is the walking, and which a surprising number of migrants never do, because they arrive under pressure, work immediately, commute mechanically, and live for years in a functional archipelago while wondering why the place never took. And the third is going back, when it is possible, not to move, but to run the map against the ground, which people do instinctively, and which we now have some reason to think is doing something specific, rather than being mere sentiment. There is a fourth thing, smaller and available to anyone tonight, which follows directly from the mechanism. If you have a place you cannot return to, walk it in your head, deliberately and in order, rather than looking at photographs of it. Start at a door and move through it room by room, in sequence, at walking pace, noticing the turns and the thresholds. That is not the same operation as remembering. A photograph engages the visual system and produces an image, while a mental walk engages the spatial system and runs the map. People who do this report retrieving material that photographs never touch, which is exactly what you would predict, and it is also, incidentally, precisely what the ancient memory technique does. The house is still in you. It can be walked. And unlike the actual building, that version cannot be sold or demolished, which is a modest consolation, and is not nothing when the alternative is nothing at all. There is one specific use of that worth mentioning, because people arrive at it independently and are often surprised by how well it works. If you are sitting with someone who is very old or ill, or whose recall of events has become unreliable, ask them to walk you through a house they lived in long ago. Not what happened there, the house. Start at the front door and go room by room. What is on the left? What the stairs were like? Where the kitchen window looked out? The material that comes back in response to that question is frequently far richer than anything a direct question about the past produces, and it comes back in a person who may have been unable to answer anything else that day. The reason follows from tonight. You are not asking them to retrieve an episode, which is the fragile operation. You are asking them to run a map, which is the durable one, and the episodes are indexed to it and arrive as passengers. Anyone who has stumbled onto this by accident will recognize the description. It is one of the few reliable ways to have a real conversation with someone whose memory has begun to fail, and it costs nothing but the willingness to ask about a hallway. The traditions have thought about exile with an intensity that no other human experience except death has attracted, and their language is worth hearing, because they were not describing a housing problem. Exile in the Hebrew Bible is not primarily a geographical inconvenience. It is a rupture, a condition of the whole person. And the literature produced from it contains one of the most quoted lines about place ever written, by people sitting beside a river in a foreign country, unable to sing. What is striking in that material is that it never treats the longing as a weakness to be overcome or a sentimentality to be outgrown. It treats it as an accurate perception of a real dislocation. And it builds practices around holding it rather than resolving it, an annual retelling that positions every participant as someone who came out of somewhere else, a prayer said facing a specific direction, a phrase repeated at the end of a meal about a place many of the people saying it had never seen. What is remarkable about that arrangement, considered as a piece of human engineering, is that it kept a map alive for 2,000 years in people who had never stood on the ground, a direction to face, a phrase to say annually, a set of practices that positioned every generation as having come out of somewhere. Whatever one believes about the theology, it is an extraordinary demonstration of something this whole night has been circling, that a place can be carried, transmitted, and held by people who have never been there, provided the carrying is done with the body and repeated on a schedule. Most cultures that lost their land lost it. That one did not, and the mechanism it used was not memory in the ordinary sense, but a set of physical practices performed at intervals for 100 generations. And the traditions did something else with the idea, which cuts in the opposite direction and is worth taking seriously by anyone who has moved. Almost all of them, at some point, universalize the exile. They take the specific condition of having lost a place and redescribe it as the general condition of being a human being at all. The Christian tradition speaks of its people as resident aliens, sojourners, citizens of somewhere else, and it means everyone, not only migrants. Buddhist teaching treats the search for a permanent resting place as the fundamental error, and homelessness as a formal spiritual state that monastics adopt deliberately. Hindu tradition prescribes, in its scheme of life stages, that a person eventually leave the household altogether and become a wanderer. In each case, the tradition is saying the same structurally strange thing, that the ache of not being at home is not a problem produced by having moved, but the standard human condition, which moving merely makes visible. There is a version of that claim which is not theological at all, and which anyone can check against their own life. Ask people who never moved, who still live in the town they were born in, whether they feel entirely at home. A surprising number will say something odd, that the place has changed around them, that the people they were at home with are gone, that they feel like a stranger in their own street. They did not move, and they have the same complaint, which suggests that the object of the longing is not primarily geographical. What people appear to want is a place that matches a map, and the map they are matching against is not only spatial, it includes a period, a set of people, and a version of themselves. Nobody can return to that, including the people who never left, because the coordinates include a time, which is either bleak or clarifying depending on the hour, and at this hour I would suggest it is clarifying. It means the migrant is not uniquely afflicted. They are simply the case where the mismatch is visible on a map. The break goes on, hard. None of that is a neurological claim, and the fact that a tradition finds meaning in dislocation is not evidence about place cells. A structural parallel is not a proof, and there is a real danger in this move, which is that it can be used to tell displaced people that their loss is spiritually convenient, which is obscene when said by anyone who has not lost anything. But there is something legitimately here, and it is this. Every tradition that examined the feeling of not being at home concluded that it is not evidence of having done something wrong. Some of them located the true home elsewhere, some denied there is one, and none of them told the person that they should simply have settled better, which is, at minimum, a more accurate response than the one our own culture offers, where a person who cannot settle is usually advised to try harder to be grateful. And there is a practice in more than one of these traditions which looks, from the outside, like deliberate self-sabotage, and which makes sense under everything we have said. Certain observances require people to leave their houses and live for a period in a temporary structure, or to spend a season on the road, or to sleep somewhere other than their bed. The stated reasons are theological and vary. The effect is uniform. It interrupts the automatic map, forces the body into a place it has not internalized, and produces, deliberately, the mild disorientation that everyone else spends their lives avoiding. Whatever the intention, it is a scheduled reminder that the ease of being at home is a construction and not a fact about the world, delivered in the only way such a reminder can be delivered, which is by removing it for a week and then giving it back. People who complete such observances routinely describe the return to an ordinary bed as a specific pleasure they had forgotten was available, which is exactly what you would expect from a machine that has been switched to manual and then allowed to resume. There is one more asymmetry worth naming before the reckoning, and it concerns who gets to choose. Everything in this section has assumed a person who moved, which implies a decision. A great many people did not decide. Refugees, people displaced by war or flood or economics, people who left because staying was not survivable, are in the same neurological situation with none of the compensations, and it is worth saying plainly that the advice to walk your new neighborhood is offered to someone who has a neighborhood and permission to walk in it. The mechanism is the same for everyone. The circumstances in which it can be applied are not. And there is a particular cruelty in the case of forced displacement, which the account makes visible. The person retains, in full working order, a detailed map of a place they cannot return to, sometimes a place that no longer physically exists. And that map will go on being maintained for the rest of their life by machinery, with no capacity to be told what happened. That is not a metaphor for trauma, it is a description of one component of it. So the picture is nearly complete. A map built by moving, consolidated in sleep, requiring months and connections rather than visits. A childhood foundation built by quantity and scale and timing that cannot be reproduced later. Two things called home, one obtainable anywhere and one obtainable once. And a set of traditions that took the ache of dislocation seriously enough to build practices around it, rather than telling anyone to get over it. But I promised you an accounting, and the objections here are substantial, that this whole framework takes a rodent navigation system and drapes human belonging over it, and that the practical advice amounts to telling lonely people to go for a walk. And there is a final question standing behind all of it, which is what any of this says about the feeling that a place is yours, when the place cannot know you and does not care, and when the map, in the end, is entirely inside your own head. That reckoning is where we go now. Your home is inside your head, not your memory of it, not your feelings about it, not a picture, a functioning structure made of your own tissue, in which particular cells stand for particular ground, built by your own body walking, and still running tonight for places you can no longer visit. This is not a metaphor, and it is not consolation. It is what a Nobel Prize was given for in 2014, after 40 years of work that began with a man listening to a single neuron click, and it means the most portable thing you own is the one thing you always assumed you had left behind. But before you take that, you should watch it survive the strongest arguments against it, because a comfort you have not tested is worth nothing at this hour. The first objection is the one a neuroscientist would make, and it has been standing at the edge of this all night. It says, you have taken a spatial navigation system discovered in rats, whose function is to let an animal find food and return to a burrow, and draped human belonging over it. Place cells encode location. They do not encode meaning, or attachment, or the particular ache of a demolished house. The fact that the hippocampus does both spatial and episodic work is a real anatomical finding, and it does not license the leap from I have a map of my childhood home to my childhood home is part of what I am. That leap is doing all the emotional work in this video, and none of it is supported. That objection is largely correct, and I accept its structure. Here is what I would put beside it. The claim is not that place cells contain your love of a house. It is narrower, that the place is not an optional accompaniment to your memories, but part of the machinery that indexes them, and that this is why losing a place produces effects out of proportion to what a purely sentimental account would predict. The feeling is not in the cells. The feeling is in a person, but the person is organized, in part, by a system that keeps ground, and there is a test for whether the connection is doing real work or merely sounding good, which is whether the account predicts anything a purely sentimental one would not. I think it does in several places, and they are worth listing, because they are what the objection has to explain away. It predicts that spatial disorientation should be an early symptom in the disease that destroys autobiographical memory, and it is. It predicts that people who learn a city intensively should show measurable change in the relevant structure, and taxi drivers do. It predicts that returning to a place should produce something that photographs do not, and it does. It predicts that a mental walk through a house should retrieve material that a direct question does not, and it does. It predicts that a person's dementia-driven urge to go home should target the oldest and most rehearsed map rather than a random one, and it does. A sentimental account predicts none of those. It is compatible with them, which is not the same thing. That is the difference between a mechanism and a mood, and it is why the connection is worth making, despite the objection being formally correct. The second objection is aimed at the most exciting part of the night, and it is the one I flagged as I went. The suggestion that grid cells map concepts and social relationships rests on indirect evidence, a statistical signature in imaging data. Taken as a proxy for a cellular mechanism nobody has recorded in a person thinking about a friendship. The social space work is young. The literature has the shape of a field in its enthusiastic phase, where an elegant idea attracts confirmations, and the replication reckoning that other areas of psychology have been through has not yet arrived here. So a skeptic who says that the cognitive map of concepts is currently a hypothesis rather than a finding is correct, and I said so at the time. What survives if it collapses entirely? Everything that matters tonight. The spatial system, the maps, the overlap with episodic memory, the childhood foundation, the invalidated map, the compulsion to return. None of that depends on whether the same machinery also handles abstractions. That part was the interesting speculation. It was never the load. The third objection is the most deflating and deserves the most direct answer. It says, your practical conclusion, after 3 hours is that people who feel out of place should go for walks. That is thin. It ignores poverty, immigration status, disability, and the fact that a great many people are not out of place because their map is incomplete, but because they are unwelcome, unemployed, or alone. And no amount of walking addresses any of that. I accept every word of it. The mechanism describes one component of feeling at home, the automatic spatial one, and it is genuinely not the largest component for most people. Belonging is made of other people, safety, work, language, and being treated as though you have a right to be there, and a video about place cells cannot touch any of that. What it can do is identify the one component that is under a person's control, explain why it takes longer than expected, and remove the interpretation that failing to feel settled after 2 years is a personal deficiency. That is a small offer. It is offered as small. And there is something worth saying to anyone for whom the larger components are the problem, because they are the majority, and this video cannot help them and should at least be honest about it. If you are somewhere you are not welcome, or where you cannot work, or where the language locks you out of every ordinary exchange, then the incompleteness of your spatial map is the least of what is happening, and no amount of walking will address it. Belonging is substantially a political and economic condition, not a neurological one, and a person can have a perfect map of a city that will not have them. I am describing one gear in a much larger machine. It happens to be a gear that is under individual control, which is why it is worth knowing about, and it is nowhere near the whole apparatus. There is a fourth objection, and it comes from someone who has accepted everything and drawn a bleak conclusion. It says, if the foundation is laid in childhood and cannot be rebuilt, then you have just told a very large number of people that the thing they most want is permanently unavailable to them, and dressed it as science. Migrants, people who moved for work, anyone raised in a family that relocated repeatedly, care leavers who had no stable childhood place at all. On this account, they are all missing a foundation, and there is nothing to be done. That is a heavy thing to tell someone at 2 a.m, and it is presented as anatomy, so that it cannot be argued with. I take that seriously, and here is the honest reply. The foundation is not a requirement for a good life. It is one thing among many, and the evidence that people without it are worse off is non-existent, because nobody has studied it and there is no reason to assume it. What I have described is a difference in how 2 kinds of map are built, not a hierarchy of who is properly at home. And there is a specific point for anyone who moved often as a child, or had no single place. What such a person lacks is a single deep map, and what they frequently have instead is unusual fluency at building new ones, which is a genuine capacity and is precisely what someone with one enormous foundation and no practice does not have. That is not a consolation prize. It is a different configuration, and it is better suited to the world most people now live in. So what survives all 4? Take it in order, because this is the version to keep. Your brain contains cells whose only function is a single location, discovered in 1971 by a man listening to a neuron click over a loudspeaker while a rat walked around a box. It contains a triangular coordinate grid generated internally, corresponding to nothing in the environment, discovered in 2005. Together with head direction, boundary and speed cells, these constitute a positioning system, and the Nobel Committee said so in 2014. That system sits in the hippocampus and its neighbours, which is the same structure whose destruction produces the most profound amnesia on record. which is why the map of a place and the memory of a life are not built in separate rooms. Maps are constructed by self-motion, consolidated during sleep, and completed over months. They remain loaded after their referents are gone. And in the most common dementia, the pathology begins in the very tissue that holds the map, which is why the earliest symptom is often getting lost, and why the last destination is so often a house that came down decades ago. And beside the anatomy, a set of things that follow from it, and that anyone can check against their own experience. That walking into a building you have not entered in 20 years produces a total and immediate orientation that no photograph can produce. That returning to a childhood street makes everything smaller, because the map was measured in a smaller body's steps. That moving house is exhausting for reasons that have nothing to do with boxes, and that the exhaustion ends on the night you first reach the bathroom in the dark without thinking. That a person can live in a city for a decade, driven everywhere, and possess almost none of it. And that when you try to recall any event of your life, a room arrives with it, unbidden, usually in more detail than the content. None of those is a study. All of them are predictions of the account, available for testing in your own head, tonight, for free. And now the traditions, at length, because they have been working on this for 3,000 years, and the question they were asking is the one that is left when the anatomy is finished. The anatomy tells you that home is a structure you carry, built by your own feet, and that it survives its own referent. It has nothing to say about why the carrying hurts, or what a person owes to a place, or what it means that the ache of not belonging is apparently universal among creatures who have somewhere to live. Begin with the oldest and most sustained treatment, which is the Hebrew Scriptures, because almost the entire text is organized around displacement. It opens with an expulsion from a garden, which is to say that the first thing that happens to human beings in that account is the loss of a place and the impossibility of return. Whatever one makes of that as history or theology, notice its position, not a late development, not a complication that arises after the story is underway. It is the opening move. The first fact about the human condition, on that account, is that we are somewhere other than where we began and cannot get back, and every subsequent thing in the text happens to people in that condition. It proceeds through a family that leaves its country, a nation formed in a foreign one, a wilderness period of 40 years in which the defining condition is having left somewhere and not yet arrived, and a later exile that produced some of the most extraordinary literature on longing in any language. The material never suggests that the longing is a weakness, and it never suggests that a person should simply settle. It treats the ache as accurate, and the practices it produced are, in the terms of tonight, remarkable pieces of engineering. A direction to face while praying, a phrase said annually about a place most speakers had never seen, an entire festival in which participants are instructed to speak as though they personally came out of the country of exile. That is a map maintained by ritual, in bodies that had never stood on the ground for 2,000 years. And there is a detail in that literature which repays attention, because it is so specific about the physical. The exile psalm does not lament an abstraction. It names a river, describes the instruments hanging in the trees, records the demand of the captors for a song, and answers with a question about how such a song could possibly be sung in a foreign land. There is a vow in it about the hand forgetting its skill, which is a bodily image rather than an emotional one. Not if I stop loving the city, but if my hand forgets. That is a person who understands, without any vocabulary for it, that what they are holding is not a sentiment, but a competence. and that the loss they fear is the loss of something their body knows how to do. 2,500 years later, we can say what a hand forgetting a city would actually consist of. They could not, and they wrote the line anyway, which is what happens when accurate observation precedes the theory by a very long way. The Christian tradition inherited all of that, and then did something structurally strange with it, which is worth understanding whatever one believes. It universalized the exile. Its letters describe its people as strangers and sojourners, resident aliens, citizens of somewhere else, and crucially it applies this to everyone, including people living comfortably in the town they were born in. The claim is that the sense of not being fully at home is not a symptom of having moved, and not a problem to be fixed by better settling, but an accurate perception of the human situation. Augustine gave that its most famous formulation when he described the heart as restless until it rests in God, which is a theological claim I am not evaluating. But notice its structure as a piece of psychology. It takes the most common complaint of comfortable people, that something is missing which they cannot name, and says the feeling is not a malfunction. In a culture that treats persistent dissatisfaction as evidence that you have chosen the wrong house, the wrong city, or the wrong life, and that sells the remedy in each case, that is a genuinely different diagnosis, and it has a practical consequence that is easy to miss. If the restlessness is structural rather than situational, then the standard remedy stops making sense. Most people, feeling persistently that something is not right about where they are, respond by changing where they are, a different city, a different house, a different country. Sometimes that is exactly correct, particularly if the map genuinely has not been built. But there is a recognizable pattern in which a person moves repeatedly, each time convinced that this place is the wrong one, and arrives each time at the same feeling after 18 months, and it never occurs to them that the constant is not the location. The traditions were, in effect, warning about that pattern long before anyone had a word for it, and their warning was not that moving is wrong, but that a particular kind of ache will follow you, and that arranging your life around escaping it will keep you moving forever. Which does not mean staying put. It means being able to tell which of the two things is happening. And that distinction is genuinely useful, and nobody is taught it. The Buddhist traditions come at it from the opposite direction and arrive somewhere adjacent. They locate the problem not in the absence of a true home, but in the search for one, holding that the attempt to find a permanent resting place in an impermanent world is the fundamental error rather than an unfulfilled need. Their monastic tradition made homelessness formal. To go forth from the household life is the technical description of ordination, and the earliest communities wandered for much of the year and were permitted to settle only during the rains. The instruction that follows is not to find your place, but to stop requiring one, which sounds cold until you notice what it does to the specific suffering we have been describing all night. If the ache is caused by a map that does not match the ground, one solution is to find matching ground, which may be impossible. Another is to hold the map more lightly, which is available anywhere. That tradition took the second road, and its practitioners report that it works. And I have no way to evaluate that, beyond noting it is not a road our own culture has ever seriously offered. The instruction is more subtle than the summary suggests, and it is worth stating properly, because the crude version is genuinely off-putting. Nobody in that tradition is telling a person not to love their house. The claim is about a particular move, the conversion of I am glad to be here into I must always be here, and it must never change, which is the move that manufactures suffering out of an ordinary attachment. A person can be entirely present in a home, care for it, love the people in it, and not require the universe to guarantee its permanence. And the tradition holds that this is not a lesser form of loving, but a more accurate one, since the guarantee was never available. Whether that is achievable, or achievable by anyone with an ordinary life and no training, is a fair question. But notice how directly it addresses tonight's mechanism. The pain we have been describing comes from a map insisting on a world that has moved. The instruction is not to stop making maps, which is impossible, but to hold them as descriptions of something passing, rather than as claims about something permanent. That is a difficult discipline, and it is not nothing, and it is one of the very few responses to this problem that does not require the world to cooperate. The Hindu traditions built the same insight into the shape of a life, rather than into a monastic exception. In the classical scheme of stages, a person is a student, then a householder, and then, as age comes on, deliberately relinquishes the household. The third and fourth stages involve withdrawing from the home one has built, and, in the final stage, becoming a wanderer with no fixed dwelling at all. That is not a punishment or a failure at the end of a life. It is prescribed, and it is understood as the appropriate final movement of a human being. Whatever one makes of it, notice what it assumes, that attachment to a place is proper in its season and is meant to be released, and that the release is a stage rather than a loss. Our own culture has no equivalent, and one consequence is that the very old, who are frequently moved out of houses they lived in for 50 years, undergo exactly that transition with no framework whatsoever for what is happening to them. At the point in life when the map is oldest and the loss is heaviest, that transition deserves more attention than it gets, because it happens to almost everyone eventually and is handled almost universally badly. A person of 85 moved from a house they lived in for half a century into a room in a facility is undergoing the most demanding map-building task of their life at the point when the machinery is least able to perform it. The hippocampus is one of the structures most affected by normal aging, quite apart from disease. So the new environment does not automate. It stays effortful, sometimes indefinitely, which is one reason people in that situation are so frequently disoriented and distressed in ways that get attributed entirely to cognitive decline. Some of it is decline. Some of it is that they have been asked to build a map with reduced machinery, at speed, having lost simultaneously the layout, the routine, the people, and the confirmation that a familiar environment provides continuously, without anyone noticing. Care staff who understand this keep the furniture in the same arrangement, avoid moving people between rooms, and let residents place their own objects, and all of that is sometimes described as sentimental attachment to belongings. It is not. It is scaffolding for a map that cannot be rebuilt from scratch. Now the break, held down hard, because this is where the night could turn dishonest. None of those traditions was making a claim about the entorhinal cortex. None of them anticipated anything in this video, and the fact that a tradition finds meaning in dislocation is not evidence for its metaphysics. A structural parallel is not a proof, and there is a specific danger here beyond the usual one, which I want to name rather than avoid. This material can be used to tell displaced people that their loss is spiritually productive, and that move is obscene in the mouth of anyone who has not lost anything. Nobody should be told that their exile is good for them. What can honestly be said is narrower. Every tradition that examined the feeling of not being at home concluded that it is not a personal failure. Some located the true home elsewhere, some denied there is one, and none of them told the sufferer they should simply have settled better. That is not a proof of anything. It is a very large body of human attention arriving at a conclusion our own culture has abandoned. Every one of them, in their different vocabularies, said some version of, "You are not broken for feeling this." That is not therapy, and it is not evidence. It is the accumulated verdict of a very large number of people who thought carefully about the same ache. Which brings me to the thing I have been circling for 3 hours. Everyone in this account is looking for a place that matches the map, and nobody can find one, and the reason is not geographical. The map includes a time. When a person says they want to go home, and they are honest with themselves about what they are picturing, it is almost never simply a set of rooms. It is those rooms with particular people in them at a particular period, when they themselves were a particular age. That configuration existed once and has been dismantled, and it is not in any country, and the plane ticket that would take you to the coordinates cannot take you to the year, which is why the returning migrant and the person standing in their own childhood street and the woman in the care home asking to go home are, at the level of the mechanism, doing the same thing, consulting a map whose referent includes a date, and finding the date missing from the world, which means the migrant and the person who never left are in the same position, and the person in the care home asking to go home is in the same position, and so, if you look at it honestly, are you. Test it on yourself and see whether the account holds. Pick the place you would name if someone asked where home is. Now ask what year you are picturing. Almost nobody pictures it as it currently is. They picture it with a particular car outside, a particular kitchen, particular people in the next room, most of whom have since moved, aged, or died. Now ask what would happen if you were transported there tonight. Exactly as it is at this moment, you would find a building. The people would be elsewhere, the arrangement would have changed, and the thing you were picturing would not be there, because the thing you were picturing has a date. This is why people who do return, who go back permanently, so often report that it did not work, and are ashamed of that too, and generally blame the place for having changed. The place did change, and that was never the problem. They went to the coordinates, and the year was not in them. And here is the part that is not bleak, though it takes a moment to turn over. If everyone is carrying a map that no longer matches, then the ache is not a sign that something went wrong in your particular case. It is the standard cost of being a creature that builds a permanent internal model of a temporary external world. Your machinery is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It keeps ground, faithfully, without any capacity to be informed that the ground has changed. That fidelity is the source of the pain, and it is also, considered plainly, an extraordinary act of preservation. Consider what would have to be true for it to work otherwise. A system that updated itself, that quietly overwrote the old floor plan when the building came down, that let go of a street once you had moved away, would spare you a great deal. It would also mean that nothing you had ever walked through was kept, that every place you left was genuinely gone, and that a person arriving at 80 would carry only the room they were currently standing in. Nobody would choose that. The keeping and the aching are not two features of the system. They are one feature, seen from two sides, and you cannot have the first without the second, any more than you can have a memory that only stores the parts you enjoyed. Nothing else you own holds anything that well. Not photographs, which fade and were only ever one angle. not documents, not your own deliberate memory, which loses almost everything. The house was sold, and you still have the house. The street was redeveloped, and you can still walk it. The people are gone, and the rooms they were in remain, intact, in tissue, maintained nightly by machinery that has never once been told to let go. And there is something worth noticing about the shape of that. The system is not sentimental. It has no opinion about which places mattered. It kept the house you loved, and it also kept a corridor in a school you hated, a waiting room, the layout of a shop that closed in 1994, and the arrangement of a bathroom in a flat you lived in for 8 months and have not thought about since. It keeps everything you walked with the same fidelity, for no reason except that walking is what builds it. Which means the preservation is not a gift arranged for your comfort, and it is not selective in your favour. It is a byproduct of how the machine works, and the fact that it happens to preserve the rooms of your childhood is the same fact that makes a person unable to stop knowing the floor plan of a house where something terrible happened. Fidelity has no preferences. That is worth holding alongside the consolation, because a video that offers only the warm half of a mechanism is not describing the mechanism. This is the same threshold every one of these investigations reaches. When we followed the body's response to events that had not yet happened, the instruments were exact and the meaning was left open. When we asked why you wake at 3, the biology was precise and silent about what to do with the hour. When we found that nothing has ever touched anything, the physics was complete and explained nothing about a hand held in a hospital room. Tonight the anatomy is clear, and it cannot tell you where you belong. The universe is generous with facts and silent about their significance. That silence is not emptiness. It is the space where a person becomes responsible for their own understanding, which is the only place understanding has ever come from. And notice the pattern one more time. The closer we look at something ordinary, in this case the feeling of walking into your own kitchen, the stranger and larger it becomes. So what do you do with this? 4 things, and none of them costs money. First, and this is the one with actual evidence behind it, if you have moved and it has not taken, walk, not for exercise, and not with a destination, repeatedly, on foot, connecting the places you already know to each other, from different directions, for months. That is the construction process, and there is no substitute for it. And a surprising number of people have lived somewhere for a decade without ever doing it. Second, stop treating the failure to feel settled as a verdict on you or on the place. It is a construction that has not finished, and the timescale is longer than anybody tells you, closer to a year than to a month, and longer again if you are not walking. People give up on new cities at 18 months, routinely, and conclude the place was wrong, when what actually happened is that they stopped 2/3 of the way through a build. Third, if there is a place you cannot return to, walk it in your head, rather than looking at photographs, door by door in order, at walking pace. It engages a different system and returns different material. Do it once, and notice what arrives that you had not asked for. And fourth, if you are sitting with someone whose memory is failing, ask them about a house rather than about their life. Start at the front door. You will get further than any direct question has taken you in months. And there is a 5th thing, for the version of this that most people will eventually face, which is being the one who has to move an elderly parent. Take the furniture, keep the arrangement, put the same objects in the same relationships if you possibly can, and resist the very reasonable sounding suggestion that this is the moment to declutter. You are not indulging a sentimental attachment to a lamp. You are supplying landmarks to a system that has to rebuild a map with reduced machinery, and every familiar object in a familiar position is a fixed point it can build from. Tonight, when you close your eyes, you will be lying in a place your brain has mapped so thoroughly that you could cross it in complete darkness without a single conscious decision. You have never noticed that this is remarkable. If you get up in the night, you will not navigate, something will navigate for you, using a structure it built out of your own movement over months, without asking permission and without ever presenting you with a bill. That system has done this for every place you have ever lived. It is doing it now, and it has kept every one of them. Consider what that means about the ordinary experience of arriving home, which happens to you most days and which you have never once found remarkable. You come through a door and something relaxes. It is not that you recognize the hallway. Recognition is a slow conscious operation, and this is not that. It is that a map loads, instantly and completely. And the enormous continuous work of navigating consciously stops. That relief is available nowhere else. It is one of the reliable pleasures of a human life, and almost nobody has ever noticed it happening, because the defining characteristic of the thing is that it removes the effort you were not aware of making. The feeling of being home is, in significant part, the feeling of a machine going quiet. It is not an emotion added to a place. It is the absence of a load. Somewhere in you tonight, there is a house that no longer stands. There is a street with the shops that were there when you were 9, in the order they were in, with the corner you had to turn to reach the one that sold sweets. There is a bedroom on a particular side of a landing, and you know which side without deciding. There is a country, in a version that has been superseded, still accurate to a year that ended. None of it can be visited, and all of it is intact, and no fire, no sale, no demolition, no war and no border has ever been able to reach it, because it was never made of brick. It was never made of brick. It was made of you walking, and you are still here. So do not apologize for missing a building, not to your family, who will say it was only bricks, and not to yourself at 2 a.m. And do not conclude, if the new place has not taken yet, that you have failed at something everyone else finds easy. It is a construction project, and it is not finished, and the materials are ordinary. Everyone is carrying ground that no longer exists. Everyone is homesick for a time as much as for a place, including the people who never went anywhere, including the ones who look entirely settled to you. The map you are standing in was built by your own feet, and it will keep every room you ever loved, faithfully, long after the rooms are gone. Tonight, lie down in the place you have mapped, and before you sleep, walk one old hallway. Start at the door,